La Follette, Tennessee. On the morning of December 2nd, 2014, Rhonda Doherty woke up early, just like she always did, and made her husband's lunch. It was a Tuesday. Nothing about it felt different. Charles kissed her goodbye around 6 a.m., climbed into his truck, and headed out to a construction site near Clearfield, Tennessee. It was a remote stretch of countryside where cell phones were basically useless. He figured he'd be back around 6 that evening. They'd been doing this for 34 years. The same rhythm, the same goodbye, the same quiet trust that the other person would be there when you got home. Rhonda was 49 years old, a beautician, a volunteer at Coolidge First Baptist Church, a mother of 3 grown children, and she was just weeks away from becoming a grandmother for the first time. Her eldest daughter, Danelle, was expecting. By every measure that matters in a small Tennessee town, Rhonda Doherty had a good life. She and Charles were high school sweethearts. They built everything together: a home in the Coolidge neighborhood of La Follette, an insurance business, a family. Their daughter later said her parents had the kind of marriage you see in movies but don't actually think exists in real life. That morning, Rhonda mentioned she had a few errands to run, maybe some shopping, maybe a trip to Knoxville, which was about an hour away. Charles told her he'd be home late, around 6. She said she'd see him later, and he walked out the door. That was the last conversation they would ever have. When Charles pulled into the driveway at 6 p.m. that evening, the very first thing he noticed was the front door. It was wide open. He called out for Rhonda. Nothing. He walked through the house. Her coffee cup was sitting on the kitchen counter, completely untouched. Her cell phone was there. Her car was still parked in the driveway. Her purse hadn't moved. But Rhonda was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, nothing unusual at all. The house looked exactly as it should have, except for the fact that the woman who lived there had simply vanished. Charles called 911 at 6:30 p.m. When detectives from the Campbell County Sheriff's Office arrived, they immediately recognized that this was not a typical missing persons case. A 49-year-old woman with no history of erratic behavior, no mental health concerns, and no known enemies. Women like that don't just walk away from their coffee, leave their phone and car behind, and disappear into thin air. The detectives contacted Rhonda's mother, Nancy Kitts. She hadn't heard from her daughter either. And that, Nancy said, was completely unlike Rhonda. They talked almost every single day. There was hardly a day that went by without a phone call between them. That night, detectives had a tracking dog brought out to the property. If Rhonda had wandered off, if she'd fallen somewhere, hurt herself, or gotten disoriented, the dog would find her. The canine picked up Rhonda's scent almost immediately. It followed the trail from inside the house, through the yard, and straight down to the edge of the sidewalk. And right there, at the curb, the trail went cold. It just stopped, as if Rhonda had gotten into a vehicle and driven away, or been driven away. By the end of that first night, investigators were fairly certain they were dealing with an abduction. The search began the next morning. Volunteers fanned out through the wooded hills around the Doherty home. Rhonda's children, Danelle and her siblings, threw themselves into the effort. Danelle, who was visibly pregnant, later said she just shut off every emotion she had. She didn't let herself feel afraid. She didn't let herself cry. She turned off everything inside her and focused entirely on one thing: finding her mother. But after hours of searching through the brush, timber, and creek beds, there was nothing. No trace, no clothing, no shoe, nothing. Meanwhile, a special agent with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation took over the case. Investigators knew the statistics. When a married woman disappears, you look at the husband first. That's not cynicism, that's arithmetic. In the vast majority of these cases, the perpetrator is someone close to the victim: a spouse, a partner, a friend. So, they brought Charles in. The interview was respectful, but pointed. How was the marriage? Any affairs? Any money problems? Any life insurance policies? Charles answered everything. He said the marriage was solid. No financial trouble, no infidelity on either side. He told them he'd left for work at 6 in the morning, driven to a construction job near Clearfield, an area with absolutely zero cell reception, worked all day, and came home to an empty house at 6 that evening. Investigators needed to verify that. Because if Charles had been at that job site all day with no cell signal, he had an alibi, but only if someone else could back it up. Detectives tracked down Charles's co-workers. Every single one of them confirmed it. Charles was on the site all day. He never left. He literally couldn't have done it. With the husband officially cleared, the investigation pivoted, and the very first lead, it came directly from Charles himself. During a follow-up conversation with investigators, Charles mentioned something that had been nagging at him. In the days before Rhonda vanished, she had been communicating online with someone identifying himself as Charlie. He said he had coats he wanted to donate to the church, Coolidge First Baptist, where Rhonda volunteered. At first, it didn't seem especially alarming. Rhonda was involved with the church, and a message like that could easily have sounded routine. Still, she was cautious. Instead of going alone, she asked Charles to come with her. So the two of them drove to the church parking lot together and waited at the agreed time. No one came. They waited for roughly 30 minutes. No donor appeared. No clothing was dropped off. Eventually, Charles assumed it had probably been some kind of prank or misunderstanding. They went home and, for the time being, put it behind them. But later, that strange exchange and the meeting that never happened would come to seem far more important than anyone realized at the time. While investigators were working the Rhonda Daugherty disappearance, the Campbell County Sheriff's Office was dealing with what appeared to be a completely unrelated violent crime. On December 5th, 3 days after Rhonda vanished, an elderly couple named Jim and Diane Fields were robbed at gunpoint inside their home in the Deerfield community, just a few miles from the Daugherty residence. The victims described a large, bald man who forced his way in, held them at gunpoint, and tied them up. But it was what the man said to them that stuck in the detectives' minds. He told them, "I'm in trouble. I gotta get some money and get out of town." That's a very unusual thing for an armed robber to say. Most criminals don't explain their motivations to their victims. This sounded less like a professional hit and more like someone in the middle of a massive crisis, someone who had done something terrible and was scrambling to escape the fallout. The victim said the man drove away in a dark gray SUV. Investigators immediately went public with the description. And the very next day, the news coverage produced exactly what they were hoping for: a tip. Someone called in and reported that a man matching that description had been staying at a hotel. Not just any hotel, the Country Inn and Suites, barely 20 miles from Rhonda Daugherty's home. Investigators were there within hours, and what they found on that hotel's surveillance footage would crack this entire case wide open. The hotel had cameras everywhere: the parking lot, the lobby, the hallways, the reception desk. Investigators started with the exterior footage from the morning of December 2nd, the exact morning Rhonda disappeared. At 7:42 a.m., a large, bald man in a purple polo shirt walked out of the hotel. He perfectly matched the physical description of the armed robber: a white male, about 5'9", somewhere between 250 and 300 pounds. But here's what immediately stood out to investigators. This man walked over to the back of a dark gray SUV, the same type of vehicle from the robbery, and began assembling flat-packed cardboard boxes right there in the parking lot. He pulled clothing out of a bag and placed it into the boxes. Clothing donations, just like the messages from Charlie had described. Investigators desperately needed to see this man's face. They switched to the interior corridor camera. At 7:44, the man in the purple shirt appeared in the hallway, stopped, and entered a room. But his face was blocked, first by the camera angle and then by an exit sign hanging from the ceiling. It was maddening. Investigators were staring right at their prime suspect's back, watching him move through the hotel like a ghost. They asked the hotel for the guest's name, but the room had been booked with an anonymous prepaid gift card. A total dead end. Investigators kept watching the footage. 14 minutes later, the man emerged from the same room, but he looked completely different. He was now dressed head to toe in camouflage. He was wearing what appeared to be black military-style boots. He was carrying a small black duffel bag. He walked to the dark gray SUV, placed the duffel bag inside, spent an unusual amount of time arranging something in the back seat, and drove away. Investigators believed they had just watched a man preparing his vehicle for an abduction, but they still couldn't see the guy's face. So they switched over to the reception desk footage from the night before, December 1st, the evening before Rhonda vanished. They started scrolling, and at 7:59 p.m., someone walked through the front doors of the hotel who made everything suddenly click. It was Lonnie Van, a former teacher at Lafayette Middle School. Not bald, not wearing camouflage, just regular Lonnie with his full head of brown hair walking up to the front desk and checking into the hotel. The exact same hotel, the exact same night. Investigators kept watching. 3 minutes later, Van reappeared, loaded down with bags, and walked down the corridor. He stopped outside a room, the exact same room the bald man had entered the next morning, and went inside. The reaction was immediate. This was the break they had been looking for. They tracked down the hotel maid who cleaned the room. She remembered it vividly. She told investigators that when she went in to clean, she found a massive pile of hair left in the bathroom sink, as if someone had shaved their entire head. Investigators watched both sets of footage side by side. The gate was the same. The size was the same. The room was the same. Lonnie Van had checked into this hotel the night before Rhonda disappeared, shaved his head to disguise his appearance, dressed in camouflage with new military boots, packed a duffel bag, loaded boxes of clothing into his vehicle, and driven away on the morning of December 2nd. And his wife thought he was in Indianapolis. Now investigators had a direction. They went back to the hotel room's trash and found a shoebox. Inside that box was a Walmart receipt. The boots that originally came in that box were the exact same military-style boots the bald man had been wearing on camera. The receipt was from a Walmart in the nearby town of Clinton, dated December 1st, the night before Rhonda disappeared. Investigators immediately went to that Walmart. The store scanned the receipt, cross-referenced it with their own surveillance system, and queued up the footage from just before 9:40 p.m. on December 1st. And there he was again, Lonnie Van. No ambiguity this time. Full face on camera, shopping. This is the exact moment where this stops being a missing persons case and becomes something much more serious. Because here is what Lonnie Van purchased at Walmart on the evening of December 1st, 2014, roughly 12 hours before Rhonda Daugherty vanished. One pair of black military-style boots, 2 large black duffel bags, a 50-count box of nitrile gloves, a hair trimmer, 2 rolls of duct tape, and 3 Monster energy drinks. Just think about that list for a moment. The boots, to change his footwear and avoid leaving traceable prints. The duffel bags, large enough to carry what exactly? The nitrile gloves, the kind that leave no fingerprints. The hair and beard trimmers, to alter his appearance. The duct tape, to bind someone. This wasn't impulse shopping. This was a checklist. Every single item appeared to serve a specific purpose, in a plan Lonnie Van had clearly been putting together for some time. Investigators immediately issued an alert. Lonnie Lee Van, 44 years old, was added to a most wanted list. A $5,000 reward was offered. He was officially described as potentially armed and dangerous. While the search for Van expanded across the state, investigators caught another break. And this one came from Van's own brother, Mike. Mike Van had a small fishing boat docked at Sugar Hollow Marina on Norris Lake. A couple of days after Rhonda's disappearance, Mike went out to check on the boat and found something deeply unsettling. The boat was unlocked. The only other person with a key was Lonnie. Inside, Mike found muddy footprints across the deck. Some items had been moved around. And on the floor, there was a fine gray dust, a powder that absolutely shouldn't have been there. There was also a discarded receipt. It was from a Lowe's hardware store on Clinton Highway, time-stamped 12:09 p.m. on December 2nd, the day Rhonda went missing, the exact same day. Investigators sent a forensic team straight to the boat and simultaneously pulled the surveillance footage from that Lowe's store. At 12:09 on December 2nd, there was Lonnie Van, bald now, dressed in camouflage, pushing a red shopping cart through the aisles. In the cart were 2 heavy cinder blocks. He paid for them and walked out, clutching the same receipt that ended up left behind on his brother's boat. The forensic team later confirmed that the gray dust found on the boat's floor was consistent with cinder block material. Cinder blocks, a boat on a lake, and a woman who was missing. At that point, investigators were forced to confront the grim possibility they had been dreading. Rhonda Doherty was likely no longer alive, and whoever was responsible may have used those cinder blocks in an attempt to conceal her in Norris Lake. When the family was told the news, Donnell said that all hope immediately vanished. Charles said he just went numb. He couldn't feel anything. He said hearing that possibility out loud hit him, and everything just stopped. As investigators dug deeper into Lonnie Van's background, a far darker picture began to emerge. He was not a stranger to the Doherty family. Van had taught their daughter at Lafayette Middle School, coached their son's football team, and moved in the same church community. What much of the community either didn't know or didn't fully understand at the time was that months before Rhonda's disappearance, Van had already been indicted by a Campbell County grand jury in a case involving a 13-year-old student from the school where he taught. Back in October 2013, while he was still working at Lafayette Middle School, Van took the student off school grounds without permission and brought her to Coolidge First Baptist Church, the same church where Rhonda volunteered. According to the case, he then behaved in a way that was completely inappropriate and deeply disturbing toward the student. Afterward, investigators found evidence that Van had tampered with the church's surveillance footage, apparently trying to erase or conceal what had happened. And this is the part that matters most in the timeline of Rhonda's case. Despite those charges, Van posted bond and remained out in the community. He was still around the same people, still moving in the same circles. And one of the witnesses in the case against Van was Rhonda's husband, Charles Doherty, who was expected to testify against him. Think about what that means. Van was facing serious charges. His career was effectively over. His reputation had collapsed. And one of the people tied to the case against him was the husband of a woman he knew personally, a woman from the same church community. Investigators would later come to believe that Rhonda may not have been chosen at random. Their theory was that this may have been personal, a way of striking back at Charles by going after the person he loved most. With Van's history now in full focus, investigators looked back at the earlier church parking lot incident in a very different light. Before Rhonda disappeared, she had received messages from someone calling himself Charlie, claiming he had clothing to donate to the church. Rhonda volunteered there, so, on the surface, the request seemed believable. But Rhonda was cautious. Instead of going alone, she brought Charles with her. The two of them arrived at the church parking lot and waited. 30 minutes passed. No one came. No clothing was delivered. No donor ever appeared. At the time, it may have seemed like a strange mix-up or a prank. But later, investigators came to believe something much more troubling. This may have been Van's first attempt to get Rhonda alone. If that was the plan, it failed the moment Charles showed up beside her. Whoever had arranged that meeting never approached them, never stepped forward, never tried to make contact. Seeing Rhonda with her husband may have been enough to make Van back off and disappear. And that changes the meaning of the clothing completely. It appears the donation story was simply a pretext, a way to draw Rhonda into a vulnerable situation under familiar, trustworthy circumstances. That first attempt didn't work, so Van regrouped. And on December 2nd, with Charles away in Clearfield and Rhonda home alone, investigators believe he tried again. Van checked into the hotel the night before. He changed his appearance. He bought supplies. He prepared his vehicle. And sometime that morning, while Rhonda sat at home with her coffee, Lonnie Van arrived. A tracking dog followed Rhonda's scent from inside the house to the curb. And there it stopped. She had gotten into a vehicle. Whether she did so willingly, perhaps because she recognized Van, or because he gave her a believable reason to come with him, or whether she was forced, may never be known for certain. While all of this was happening, Van's wife believed her husband was in Indianapolis working a new trucking job. He had told her about the position. He had sent her photographs from the Indianapolis area, images that appeared to show him there, helping build a believable story that placed him hundreds of miles from Lafayette, Tennessee. But it was all fabricated. Every text, every photo, every detail about the trucking job. Van was constructing an alibi in real time, feeding his wife a carefully built fiction while he was actually just 20 miles from the Daugherty home, putting his plan into motion. After robbing an elderly couple at gunpoint on December 5th, Van fled east. He moved quickly, crossing state lines and putting as much distance as possible between himself and Tennessee. Investigators released his description and information on the vehicles connected to him across the region. But it wasn't a traffic stop that found him. It was technology. Investigators used an email tracing tool, a digital method that could identify the IP address of whoever opened a specific message. They sent the email. Van opened it, and the IP address led them to a resort in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. On December 12, 2014, 10 days after Rhonda Daugherty vanished, authorities in South Carolina located Lonnie Van in Myrtle Beach and took him into custody. At last, he had been found, but Rhonda was still missing. By the second week after Rhonda's disappearance, investigators had begun linking the Charlie messages to Lonnie Van through a combination of digital forensics and surveillance review. After Rhonda vanished, Charles gave investigators access to her computer and social media accounts. There they found Facebook messages from a user calling himself Charlie, who had offered to donate clothing to the church. The messages stopped on the same day Rhonda disappeared. Investigators made an emergency request to Facebook for account data tied to that profile. The company provided the IP address used to access it. Technical analysis traced that address back to Van's home. At the same time, investigators reviewed license plate recognition data from around Lafayette. That review showed Van's personal vehicle, a white Ford Expedition, near the church when Rhonda and Charles went to meet Charlie. It also placed the same vehicle near the Daugherty home on the day Rhonda disappeared. A second vehicle also became important, a Chevrolet Captiva that Van had rented on December 1st, the day before Rhonda vanished. Investigators determined that he used that rental vehicle in the period leading up to Rhonda's disappearance to travel to Walmart and Lowe's, to purchase supplies, and to check into a hotel in Clinton. Taken together, the two vehicles suggested planning. The rented SUV appeared to have been used to avoid drawing attention during the setup, while Van's own Ford Expedition was used on the day Rhonda disappeared and during his flight east. With the IP address and the camera data in hand, investigators obtained a search warrant for Van's home. By then, he had already fled to South Carolina. But inside the house, forensic examiners found more digital evidence pointing in the same direction. Access to the fake Charlie account, internet searches related to restraints and concealment, and signs that Van had been monitoring Charles Daugherty's social media activity to learn his work schedule. Then investigators traveled to South Carolina to search Van's Ford Expedition themselves. What they found inside became one of the most important physical breaks in the case. In the vehicle, they recovered a black duffel bag, consistent with the duffel bags Van had purchased at Walmart on December 1st. They also found zip ties commonly used as restraints. Those zip ties were sent to a forensic lab for DNA testing. The results came back with Rhonda Daugherty's DNA on them, her DNA, on restraints found in his vehicle, more than 1,000 miles from home. That result became a critical piece of physical evidence, allowing prosecutors to move forward with the most serious charges in the case. On January 7, 2015, a grand jury in Campbell County returned a formal indictment against Lonnie Lee Van. The charges were severe. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of kidnapping, multiple counts of aggravated robbery, tampering with evidence, and assault. Bond was set at $1 million. Van was extradited from South Carolina back to Tennessee to face prosecution. By that point, investigators and prosecutors had assembled a substantial case. Surveillance footage, DNA evidence, purchase records, hotel records, cell phone data, and witness testimony. The timeline they had built was powerful, but there was one devastating problem. They still did not have Rhonda, and in a case like this, that matters. Prosecuting a homicide without a body is extraordinarily difficult. There is no autopsy, no confirmed cause of death, no way to physically present the full reality of what happened. The defense can always argue uncertainty. They can suggest the victim may still be alive, even when the surrounding evidence points in a much darker direction. And juries, even when presented with strong circumstantial evidence, can struggle with that absence. People want finality. They want something they can see. So prosecutors began exploring the possibility of a plea agreement. While the legal process moved forward, search teams began a systematic effort to find Rhonda at Norris Lake. The reasoning was difficult to ignore. Van had purchased cinder blocks, dust consistent with cinder block material was found on his brother's fishing boat, and the receipt was from the day Rhonda disappeared. Taken together, investigators came to believe the lake may have been used to conceal what happened to her. Multiple teams joined the search, including local authorities, federal agents, and volunteer dive crews. They focused on the area around Sugar Hollow Marina. They used sonar, searched underwater, and worked the lake for weeks, but they found nothing. Norris Lake is vast, deep, and difficult to search, especially in winter. Cold water, low visibility, and a dark, silty bottom made recovery efforts incredibly challenging from the start. Even so, Rhonda's family held on to hope that something would eventually be found. Some sign, some trace, anything that might help bring her home. That hope has never been fulfilled. The negotiations between prosecutors and Van's defense team lasted for months. During that time, prosecutors consulted with investigators, with Rhonda's family, and with others involved in the case. The decision in front of them was incredibly difficult. Do you take the case to trial, knowing how challenging it can be to prosecute a case like this without having found Rhonda? Do you risk the uncertainty that comes with a jury trial, even when the evidence is strong? Or do you accept a plea to lesser charges and ensure that Lonnie Van will spend the rest of his life behind bars? The family agreed. Law enforcement agreed. The plea was negotiated. On December 16, 2015, 13 months after Rhonda Daugherty disappeared, Lonnie Lee Van stood in Campbell County Criminal Court before Judge Shane Sexton. He was in shackles and handcuffs. The courtroom was full. Van ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced charges, including second-degree murder, kidnapping, 2 counts of especially aggravated robbery, tampering with evidence, and assault. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Lonnie Van was 45 years old at the time. He will not be eligible for release until he is 85. In practical terms, that means he is expected to spend the rest of his life in prison. As of this recording, Rhonda Daugherty has still not been found.